Hello everyone, welcome to our weekly SIG meeting. Today, something bad happened with the agenda. It wasn't updated last time, so if you added something, please take a look again at the agenda if the item is still there. I moved some items that we discussed last week to the last week summary, but maybe I have missed something or put something wrong. Anyway, the first item on the current agenda is from me. It's update from last week carpenter sync topic. The main part of discussion was discussion about what we should put into shared namespace. Should it be union of cluster autoscaler and carpenter functionality, or rather intersections? And we agreed on intersection and keeping product unique feature in the separate namespaces, so that people who create workload definition based on the intersection namespace could be sure that what they put in their deployments work in the similar way on both Carpenter and Cluster Autoscaler. The updated document should be available soon, and we will be reaching out to SIG architecture about the details and how APIs and namespaces should be organized. Okay, that's all from me. The next item on the agenda is Suraj.
Yeah, someone asked a question around um, supporting kubectl, something similar to kubectl rollout restart deployment, which is basically during scale down, can we have cluster autoscaler create a new pod before terminating the current pod? And it can be argued that this is in the domain of PDBs, but I wanted the community's thoughts on this. You can go to the Slack URL I've pasted and write down your thoughts.
So you're suggesting that that should be a cluster autoscaler who should be creating extra pods?
For me, I think this should be something that should go in PDB, but I think other people can have different opinions. So I'm just looking for opinions, thoughts from the community in general.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure if it's the responsibility of PDB. I probably would go for deployment on other thing like that, because PDBs don't control pod creation.
Yeah, I think that might be a good option as well.
Okay, is there any action needed on the SIG autoscaling side, or you're just pointing to the discussion?
I'm just pointing to the discussion because I thought this might be outside cluster autoscaler jurisdiction. I thought PD might be a good place, but now that you say deployment, I think that might be a good place as well. So I'm just gathering opinions, thoughts before we actually go and make some changes in there. I feel like this might be outside cluster autoscaler jurisdiction, but I'm also looking for other opinions. And if it turns out that there is value in doing something around this in cluster autoscaler, then maybe we can have an issue around this.
So my personal opinion, we may have more discussion definitely, is that it's the outside of cluster autoscaler scope, because number of pods is controlled by replica set and deployment, and if cluster autoscaler somehow try to play with it, it could probably create more harm than good and confuse other elements.
Can I get a comment in the Slack thread?
Yeah, sure, I cannot. But
Thank you.
yeah, maybe there are some arguments for having some support in cluster autoscaler. I don't see them now, but can be convinced otherwise.
Yep, makes sense. I think we can talk more in the Slack thread, maybe. Cool. This is for Guy. Any update on adding new reviewers?
Guy is on vacation, so probably no update at this moment. You have to wait.
No. Okay. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Lali. We have Lali. No, we don't. Elmiko.
Yeah, just looking for some follow-up reviews on this PR. This is the PR I talked about, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, that Alessandro created. And it's mainly for setting the default architecture type when scaling from 0. So, being able to set like ARM 64 or AMD 64 as the default type. Alessandro went back through the PR and pulled out all the various cloud provider implementations. So it's only implemented for Cluster API right now. And it does implement the flag so that a user could change the default. And Alessandro has put a bunch of code comments in there so that if other providers would like to participate in this behavior, it should be very clear to them how they could implement the defaulting behavior for CPU type. So mainly just looking to get some more reviews on this. Yeah, and see how it goes. Yeah, Jack.
Yeah, but that's just cluster API. So I assume that this is LGTM on the cluster API side. You are just wanting to have LGTM for the utility part.
Yes, and the flag. Yeah.
And the flag. Jack?
Yeah, so Mike, this behavior only manifests in scale from 0, and I guess I would expect scale to 0 as well, but
right,
other scaling scenarios works fine.
Right. In other scaling scenarios, the scheduler can detect the architecture from the nodes that are already present. But there are situations where you're scaling up from 0 where it doesn't necessarily detect the architecture. And this usually isn't a problem because I think everything's usually the same architecture inside of a cluster. But if you're running in a mixed architecture cluster, maybe you have ARM and AMD, in the same thing, then the autoscaler is not choosing the right group to scale up, where you can't limit on the architecture, on where you want to scale up. So this will make it so that by default, there will be an assumed architecture that comes out. Now, it's only implemented for cluster API right now, but others could participate if they wanted to.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that explanation. It seems so. If we have a single node pool cluster with non-AMD 64, we don't have this problem because it kind of has a default reaction. Like, okay, I need new nodes for new pods. I don't care about the architecture. I only know about this one. I'm just gonna build new nodes for this architecture, which is the only one I know about. So that works fine.
Right.
But once you have multiple pools, it's not smart enough to figure out from the pods that are pending which architecture to build. I guess I feel like I understand what's wrong. I feel it doesn't seem like introducing the concept of a default architecture really fixes the underlying problem, which the underlying problem you would imagine should be fixed by being able to actually detect the architecture that those pending pods require and then do correlation with node pool.
It's on the other side though. And honestly, Alessandro's got his hand up. He's been doing a lot of work on this. So I'll let Alessandro talk.
Hello. I'll try to show myself. Yeah. If it works, I don't know. Hello. I think there are more problems that have been discussed in this few seconds. So the one that this PR tries to solve is mainly for singular clusters in one specific case, which is the one in which a pod or a workload in general declares a predicate against the kubernetes.io/arc label. So in the case you deploy a pod with node affinity on kubernetes.io/arc equals to ARM64 only, then in that case, even if you have a single arc only cluster, the scale up from 0 will not work. Okay. The case of multi-arc compute nodes clusters, or sorry, the case of heterogeneous clusters heterogeneous in architecture is slightly different, because you need to take care of both the architecture of the nodes and the compatible architecture with the pods that you are running, right? So this it goes across the scheduler from one side, the capacity of inspecting the images, because we don't, in our specification, we don't have the information about the architecture compatible with a given image, and then the autoscaler. So this PR, the scope of this PR is very small, and dedicated to single arc non-AMD64 clusters.
And cluster API. Only cluster API, right?
Yeah, I mean, the initial PR was set for all the cloud providers, but this can, I mean, in the past meeting we said, okay, let's start from having it for cluster API first. This because we should go to discussing with all the possible providers that could be interested or not, or could even have some other code downstream for their specific implementations. And then I moved it back to only the cluster API providers, providing information for any other providers to onboard in this behavior. Okay, so all the cloud providers in upstream in that code are somehow affected by this problem, in my opinion.
Okay, cool. Do we have an idea for a solution for all providers without going per provider? It doesn't seem like this is the kind of thing that you should solve for per provider, but maybe I'm too naive to.
No, the interface, it's because the interface for providing node group templates is where this has to come from, right? Like every provider has an interface for providing the node group template when they're coming from a zero situation. So every provider would need to inject this information properly. You know, some of them, you know, Alessandro's looked at it all, but like the real problem on like, to put this in cluster API terms, you know, because Jack, that's what you and I are kind of looking at most. Like we use machine deployments as the main like kind of node group abstraction there. And so when a machine deployment's at 0 and we try to return the node template information to the core autoscaler to make the scaling decision, like we have no architecture information on the machine deployment at all. So that is really helping out in the cluster API situation, because like otherwise we'd have to dig into the, you know, the machine infrastructure templates to figure out what the architecture is or something. So anyways, sorry, Benjamin, I know you had your hand up.
Yeah, oh, hi. So we are using mixed instance type on AWS and also scaling from 0. One thing I wanted to point out, which is excellent experience for us, is that the AWS API, the AWS cloud provider is retrieving the architecture from within the AWS API. It's also, so there's you can use either way the generated instance type list, which provides CPU, number of CPU core, memory, and architecture, but it also can retrieve it from the API. So it doesn't change your, I mean, it's all your proposed change is also interesting for all the other cloud providers or for people that don't have that yet, but it's beneficial to have that. It's cool to have that anyway, for instance, for Azure, for GCP, so that the autoscaler might be able to pick the proper instance type, provided that the appending pod might have affinities to ARM or Intel and so on. So that means both effort, I think, are beneficial. At least from our experience, the AWS behavior is pretty cool. So I don't know if you are interested in that, and we can also contribute that kind of changes.
So that's the tough part for cluster API though, Benjamin. Like on AWS, you're absolutely right. The SDK has a lot of this information in it. So in the AWS provider, it can look to the SDK to determine what the architecture type and then return it is. Or it could just make a quick query to AWS's API to determine this. Cluster API, because internally Cluster API uses CRDs to represent the machine types. And every provider of cluster API, meaning every, cluster API could have an AWS provider, an Azure provider, So the cluster API plugin for cluster autoscaler, then, if it wanted to determine what the type of the actual architecture of the machine was, it would have to go get this other object, which is like the infrastructure template. And then it would have to determine from that what it was. So we would have to bring a lot of provider specific implementations into our cluster API. And, I think a better way for us to do it is just by being able to surface this information manually, so we don't have to make all these calls and kind of bring all this provider specific information, into the cluster autoscaler, basically. But in general, I agree with you.
Good, it makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, Jesse.
Well, I was going to ask, is there an issue tracking, maybe calling out the contacts of each provider requesting that this be implemented at the provider level? Like when they get a chance, just making other providers aware of this issue.
I think Alessandro made a top level issue for this, but I don't think we actually like we might want to put a checklist there for the providers just to say like who's implemented and who hasn't or something. Yeah. That might be a good follow-up activity.
That'd be great.
I don't think that a regular issue would get enough attention on the cloud provider side. So if you think that it is important, we should be reaching out to cloud provider owners, directly letting them know that this thing needs to be fixed. Otherwise, I could bet that they won't, in vast majority, notice that there is some issue pending on them in cluster autoscaler repository.
Okay, thanks. That's good guidance, Marcin.
Okay, next one is Jack.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up some housekeeping topics to confirm. So I have been putting a bunch of PRs into the Azure Cloud Provider section of Cluster Autoscaler and working with the existing maintainers to find in the owner's file to get reviews and approval and all that kind of thing. Is the ladder for myself becoming a reviewer in Azure or any other provider totally self-governing from the existing Azure maintainers? Is that how the governance model works in Cluster Autoscaler?
Cloud providers, we have very simple rules. Like, are you Microsoft employee?
I am, yes.
Yeah, so you're granted, and you figure out the details with the other folks in the owners, send the PR for adding yourself there, and they will approve it.
Okay, cool. And if I wanted to advocate for more formal, for example, like copying the upstream Kubernetes contribution document, which says something like N number of reviews in the past 3 months, N number of PRs, there's some formal documents in Kates.io community. If we wanted to adopt that for our provider guidelines to help future reviewers, maintainers, is that something we can also do by ourselves, or would we want to do that in Cluster Autoscaler first?
So in vast majority, owners are employee of a particular cloud provider. And we assume that the company will figure out the details. If someone who is in, I don't know, let's say in Microsoft organization submits a code, adding themselves to the owner, I look at what's there in the GitHub profile and I assume that this is right, and I add such a person. If the new cloud provider comes, I assume that the guy who sends the code is the owner and can be added to the owner. If something changed and they let me know that, for example, there is another employee of the company that wants to contribute, then sure, we can add it and there is no extra formality. I understand that assignments in companies change quickly and person working on one thing could be moved overnight to other thing, and I don't want to put any extra hurdles and artificial requirements, I don't know, for 20 PRs in core cluster autoscaler before they can decide about their own company cloud provider. So assuming that you are a Microsoft employee, that goes directly. If you weren't, then it would be more complex. I think I would probably have to reach out to the old folks, or if they were not responsive, you would be appointed as an owner based on your contribution. We have a similar situation on AWS cloud provider, where, for example, Guy is one of the owners, because AWS cares more about their carpenter than cluster autoscaler, and PRs weren't like handled super quickly. So we have owner from outside of the company, but in vast majority of cases, it's a company employee.
Cool. That's a ton of information. Thank you so much. And then the second bullet point on my agenda item is just to volunteer myself to help with any tests in cluster autoscaler generally. I know that there's some red tests on test grid. Is that something that Guy typically owns, and wait for him to return and then I can bug him to see if I can help?
Cluster autoscaler, probably Maciek Pytel would be the best person to ask where the help would be most needed.
Okay, cool. I've managed a lot of other projects in test infra, so I know how that generally
like,
works. I'd be happy to help out if that's welcome.
Yeah, deeply appreciated. Please ping Maciek Pytel, and definitely he will be extremely happy to have someone taking care of the red test.
Okay, cool. Will do. Thanks.
Thank you for this volunteering. Okay, so we are done with the official agenda. Are there any other topics that you didn't put to the agenda? Okay, no volunteers, so I will go quickly through people who hasn't spoken yet. Jesse?
Not for me.
Yeah, Benjamin?
No.
Joachim?
No, nothing from me, thanks.
John?
Nothing today. Thanks though.
Ray?
No, I'm good, thanks.
David?
Nothing for me, thank you.
Luis?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Joel?
No, thanks.
Sophie? And Supon.
Yeah, nothing from my side.
Okay, so we are done. Thank you all for a very good discussion today, and see you again next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.